May year 1969. Deep in Vietnam's A Shau Valley, the stillness of the jungle was shattered by the thunder of artillery, the chop of helicopter blades, and the cries of men under fire. For 10 long days, the soldiers of the 101st Airborne Division would climb, bleed, and die for control of a mountain. The map's called Hill 937, but the men had another name for it, Hamburger Hill. They said it chewed up soldiers like ground meat, and by the end, it would become one of the most infamous battles of the Vietnam War. This isn't just a story of tactics and strategy. It's a story of courage, chaos, and sacrifice, of men who fought desperately for a hill that was abandoned soon after. The A Shau Valley lay less than 100 miles from the demilitarized zone. On a map, it looked like just another stretch of green jungle, but for years it had been one of the most dangerous places in Vietnam. In March year 1966, North Vietnamese troops had overrun a US Special Forces camp here after 38 hours of savage fighting. Survivors retreated through the jungle, hounded by enemy fire, until helicopters finally whisked them away. During the Tet Offensive of year 1968, the valley became a launch pad for North Vietnamese forces attacking the imperial city of Hue. American commanders responded with large operations: Delaware, Somerset Plain, Dewey Canyon. These uncovered weapons, caches, radios, and trucks. But the enemy rarely fought pitched battles. They melted into the jungle, choosing their ground carefully. Towering over this valley was Ap Bia Mountain Hill 937. To the Americans, it was just another numbered objective. But to the Montagnard tribesmen who lived nearby, it was the mountain of the crouching beast. Soon, US troops would learn why. Before we go deep, a quick show of support. If you believe our veterans deserve more respect, hit that like button, subscribe, and drop respect in the comments. Now, let's get into the story. General Creighton Abrams, who had replaced William Westmoreland, wanted the valley cleared once and for all. He turned to the 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles. The job fell to the 3rd Battalion, 187th Infantry, the Rakkasans. Their commander was Lieutenant Colonel Weldon Tiger Honeycutt. His men knew him by his call sign, Blackjack. A hard man, a veteran of Korea, Honeycutt was determined to seize Hill 937 no matter the cost. What he didn't know was that the hill was defended by the 29th North Vietnamese Army Regiment elite troops known as the Pride of Ho Chi Minh. On May 10th, Operation Apache Snow began. 65 UH-1 helicopters rose into the sky, swarming like green dragonflies. Inside, paratroopers gripped their rifles, sweat running down their helmets. The blades thundered as they descended toward landing zones, blasted open by artillery. For a moment, it looked like the landing would be easy. Delta Company touched down without opposition. But the silence was deceptive. The mountain was waiting. As Bravo Company advanced into thick jungle, men moved single file, weapons ready. The bamboo was so dense that they sometimes had to crawl. Lieutenant Frank Bacha heard it first, the sudden eruption of gunfire ahead, the cries of medic. Rocket-propelled grenades slammed into the trees, shrapnel ripping through men. Wounded stumbled back, some carried on poncho stretchers, blood soaking through the green fabric. Further up, Lieutenant Charles Denholm's platoon discovered communications wire running up the slope, the roof. The enemy was dug in on the summit. Moments later, chaos erupted. Specialist Aaron Rosenstrike, walking point, was shot in the chest. Behind him, John McCarl was struck by an RPG. The claymore he carried exploded on his back, tearing him apart. Denholm himself, bleeding from shrapnel, pulled his Bowie knife and stabbed an NVA soldier in the throat in a desperate fight for his life. Sergeant Louis Garza tried to rally what was left, dragging back the wounded under a storm of machine gun fire. And then disaster struck. 2 Cobra gunships swooped in to help, but in the confusion, they mistook coordinates and opened fire on Honeycutt's own command post. Rockets tore the treetops apart, men screamed. 2 were killed instantly, and 35 were wounded. Even Honeycutt himself was hit by shrapnel. As medics scrambled, enemy mortars from across the Laotian border began to fall, pounding the battered command post. It was only the first day. The next morning, Bravo Company moved forward again. Bocha's platoon found enemy bodies, proof they had inflicted losses. But the jungle ahead was a death trap. Suddenly, snipers tied high into treetops opened fire, RPGs exploded along the trail, men sprayed the canopy with M16 second and M60 second, watching enemy bodies tumble out of the branches. But the cost was terrible. Terry Larson fell, shot through the head. Donald Mills, the machine gunner, was hit in the chest but refused to quit grabbing an M16 and firing into a spider hole until the enemy went silent. Denholm's platoon was mauled again, barely able to hold together. By evening, Honeycutt knew the hill was bristling with bunkers, trenches, and spider holes. But instead of pulling back, he ordered more attacks. The men of the 100 first understood they weren't leaving until the mountain was theirs. At dawn on May 12, American aircraft roared overhead. A one Skyraider's drive opt bombs and strafed with cannons. Napalm set the jungle ablaze. Then Boch's men advanced into a clearing. Suddenly, the ground erupted. Claymores, machine guns, RPGs from bunkers hidden on the slope. Shrapnel tore through the platoon. 7 men were wounded, including the medic. The survivors hugged the ground, firing desperately back. Recoilless rifles were hauled forward. A round slammed into one bunker, collapsing it. But the NVA answered with RPG fire, explosions hurling men off the trail. Airstrikes pounded the slope again, bombs gouging craters, napalm turning trees into fireballs. But the NVA held fast. Meanwhile, helicopters tried evacuating the wounded. One Huey hovered overhead, engineers rappelling down, but enemy fire riddled the aircraft. A rope was cut loose, dropping an engineer who shattered both legs. Another Huey was struck by an RPG, crashing on its side. 10 men were dragged out before the wreck exploded. A medevac basket lifted a wounded man into the air, and then the helicopter was hit, falling back onto him, crushing him to death. By nightfall, the paratroopers dug in, exhausted, shaken, and bloodied. The men whispered among themselves. It was only day 3, and already they had given the hill another name, Hamburger Hill. At dawn on May 13, U.S. aircraft thundered in once more. F-4 Phantom jets screamed low over the treetops, dropping 1,000-pound bombs. Explosions tore the jungle open, the ground shuddering beneath the men. Lieutenant Bocha's first platoon was ordered forward after the strike. For 35 minutes, they climbed cautiously toward the same clearing where Denholm's men had been ambushed. The jungle suddenly gave way, and what they saw froze them. The NVA had turned the clearing into a killing field. Bunkers lined the hillside with clear arcs of fire. As Bocha's men entered, the air erupted. Claymores detonated, and shrapnel ripped through the ranks. AK-47 fire poured down. 7 men were wounded almost instantly, one of them the medic. The survivors hugged the dirt, firing upward, trapped beneath the enemy's guns. Recoilless rifles were dragged into place. Private First Class James Clifton and Specialist Philip Nelson aimed at a bunker and fired. One round slammed right into the aperture, collapsing it in a shower of dirt and wood. But the NVA responded with RPG fire. One rocket landed in front of them, throwing Clifton and Nelson down the slope. Miraculously, they survived. Moments later, a storm of RPGs crashed into the treetops. Shrapnel rained down. Bocha ordered his men back. The wounded were carried down, some groaning, others silent. By the time they reached safety, fighter jets roared in again, dropping napalm that rolled across the clearing in waves of fire. The men had survived, but the hill still stood. To evacuate casualties, Honeycutt ordered an engineer landing zone closer to Bravo Company. A Huey hovered overhead as engineers rappelled down. But the NVA were waiting. Machine gun fire riddled the chopper. The crew slashed the rope to escape, sending one engineer plunging to the ground, breaking both legs. Another Huey came in, but this one took a direct RPG hit. The helicopter slammed onto its side, spinning blades slicing into trees. Men rushed to drag out the crew. 10 were pulled clear before the wreck exploded in a ball of flame. Medevac attempts turned into death traps. One wounded man, strapped into a rescue basket, was halfway up when the helicopter was struck. It fell straight down, crushing him beneath. Blades tore through more soldiers below before the wreck detonated. Even in retreat, the hill demanded blood. On May 14, Honeycutt tried to coordinate a massive push. Before dawn, artillery batteries pounded the slopes. The jungle burned, the mountain shrouded in smoke. At 8 a.m., Bravo and Charlie companies advanced. For Bravo Company, Lieutenant Marshal Eward's platoon took the lead, but claymores exploded as soon as they entered the slope. Men screamed. 3 were killed instantly. Shrapnel shredded the survivors. They dragged the wounded back down, but enemy fire chased them the entire way. For Charlie Company, it was worse. Lieutenant James Goff's platoon pressed forward with recoilless rifles. They knocked out 3 bunkers, steel darts from flechette rounds tearing through enemy defenses. But as they pushed into the saddle between Hill 900 and Hill 937, the NVA counterattacked. They came down in waves, RPGs exploding, AK-47 second rattling. Lieutenant Donald Sullivan's platoon was hammered, over half the men killed or wounded. Casualties piled up on stretchers, but even the stretcher bearers were ambushed. Reinforcements sent to save them were ambushed too. Captain Dean Johnson, commanding Charlie, sat in shock. In just 2 hours, his company had lost nearly all of its leadership. The captain himself, lieutenants, sergeants, squad leaders, and 40 men. Survivors described him staring blankly, whispering, "I lost my company. I don't even know what I did wrong." It was the breaking point. Charlie Company had ceased to exist as a fighting force. As casualties mounted, one pilot became a legend. Chief Warrant Officer Eric Raredon flew a tiny OH-6 Loach helicopter, meant for observation, not rescue. But again and again, Raredon dove into hot landing zones, enemy bullets snapping through the air. He squeezed wounded men into the small cockpit, sometimes dragging them in under fire, and lifted off while tracers chased him. Soldiers said he seemed fearless, a guardian angel buzzing low while everyone else fled. Each time he returned, the NVA tried harder to shoot him down, but Raredon kept coming back. For many wounded that day, his little helicopter was the only reason they survived. By May 15, Honeycutt brought in Alpha Company, but they, too, were torn apart by RPGs and rockets. Friendly fire struck once more. Cobra gunships, misdirected, raked Bravo Company, killing and wounding more men. Captain Littman was badly injured. Command fell to Lieutenant Boscia. For 5 days, the cycle repeated. Artillery barrages shook the mountain. Fighter jets dropped napalm, bombs, and cannon fire. Infantry climbed forward, only to be stopped by bunkers, mines, and RPGs. Then the NVA counterattacked with fury, charging down the slopes with AK-47 second blazing. By May 17, the Rakkasans were exhausted. Platoons were at half strength. Alpha had lost 17 men, Bravo 19, and Charlie had been nearly destroyed. Replacements came in, not infantrymen, but cooks, clerks, and mechanics pulled from the rear. Fresh to combat, they were thrown into the grinder. The men gave the hill a name, whispered with bitterness, Hamburger Hill. By May 18, after more than a week of bloodshed, Honeycutt's men were battered nearly to breaking. Alpha and Bravo companies were reduced to half their numbers. Charlie Company was shattered. Delta had taken terrible losses. Yet Honeycutt refused to let another unit take the final glory. He insisted that his Rakkasans must be there for the last attack. That morning, a 2-battalion assault began. The 3rd Battalion, 187th Infantry, attacked from the north. The 1st Battalion, 506th Infantry, the Currahees, moved from the south. As the men climbed, the sky darkened. A heavy monsoon rain poured down, drenching soldiers to the bone, turning slopes into rivers of mud. Visibility dropped to 0. Boots sank knee-deep, rifles clogged with muck. Exhausted paratroopers dug in where they stood, just below the summit. By this time, Alpha and Bravo had suffered 50% casualties. Charlie and Delta had lost 80%. Yet still, orders came down, hold, and prepare for the final assault. On May 20, the Americans unleashed the heaviest bombardment of the battle. 10 artillery batteries fired 20,000 rounds into the slopes. 272 airstrikes hammered the summit. Over 1 million pounds of bombs rained down. 152,000 pounds of napalm turned the jungle into an inferno. The entire mountain shook. The jungle canopy was blasted away, leaving a barren moonscape of craters, ash, and splintered trees. At 5 p.m., the final assault began. The Rakkasans, alongside ARVN allies and elements of the 506th, climbed toward the summit. The ground was scarred and blackened, but still enemy fire snapped from surviving bunkers. Soldiers charged through smoke and mud, throwing grenades, firing M16 second, clawing uphill meter by meter. Finally, the Americans broke through. The summit of Hill 937 was theirs. The North Vietnamese had mostly slipped away, leaving behind bodies, wrecked bunkers, and the smell of smoke and death. But victory came at a terrible price. The 101st Airborne had suffered 72 men killed, 400 wounded, and 7 missing. The official body count claimed 630 North Vietnamese dead. The battle was over, but back home, it was just beginning to spark outrage. Journalist Jay Sharbit described it as a meat grinder. Newspapers published headlines of the carnage, and in the US Senate, Edward Kennedy stood on the floor and condemned the Army for what he called a senseless and irresponsible attack. "Our men," Kennedy declared, "are being sent to their deaths to capture hills and positions that have no relation to ending this conflict." His words struck a nerve. Criticism of the Vietnam War had been growing since Tet in 1968, but Hamburger Hill poured gasoline on the fire. The public asked, how could so many lives be spent on a hill that held no real strategic value? And worse, within weeks of taking Hill 937, American forces withdrew from it, leaving the mountain and the valley back in enemy hands. For the men who fought there, the memory never faded. They remembered the endless assaults up muddy slopes, the treetop snipers tied into branches, the sound of RPGs slamming into the jungle, the sight of friends carried down on poncho stretchers. They remembered the fury of Cobra gunships, sometimes even striking their own lines, the bravery of medevac pilots like Eric Raredon, diving into fire to pull out the wounded, and the grinding reality of fighting the same slopes day after day, only to see them abandoned weeks later. For America, Hamburger Hill became a symbol of courage, yes, but also of futility. It was the last major battle between US and North Vietnamese regular forces. Less than 4 years later, in March year 1973, the last American combat troops left Vietnam. 2 years after that, on the 30th of April, year 1975, North Vietnamese tanks rolled into Saigon. Hill 937 was taken, but at a cost that shook the nation. 72 Americans are dead, hundreds wounded, a mountain scarred by bombs and napalm, only to be abandoned. For the soldiers, it was 10 days of hell. For America, it was a turning point, a moment when many finally asked, was it worth it? The men of the 101st Airborne answered that question with their blood, and history remembers their sacrifice on one hill in a distant jungle, forever known as Hamburger Hill.